It starts like a normal interview, but just moments in, one unexpected question shifts the tone, and everything suddenly gets tense. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. It begins the way many daytime segments do on The View, with a light, conversational tone that gradually shifts into something more serious. The cameras settle on the panel, the audience applause fades, and the hosts ease into a discussion that, at first glance, feels familiar. There's a mix of current events, cultural commentary, and personal perspectives. Nothing out of the ordinary for the format. On this particular day, however, the dynamic changes slightly with the presence of guest Mark Wahlberg, who joins the table to talk about a recent project, but also finds himself drawn into a broader discussion. Joy Behar, as she often does, steers the conversation toward a more opinion-driven angle. Her tone remains conversational, but there's a noticeable shift in the pacing of her questions. What starts as a straightforward inquiry about Wahlberg's recent work begins to expand into a discussion about public responsibility, celebrity influence, and how public figures choose to use their platforms. The audience listens closely, some nodding along, others waiting to see where the conversation might go. Wahlberg, sitting upright with a composed posture, responds in a measured way at first. His tone is calm, his words deliberate. He acknowledges the question, offering a thoughtful answer about his approach to his career and the choices he's made over time. There's no tension yet, just a steady exchange of ideas. But even in these early moments, there are subtle cues. His pauses become slightly longer, his expressions more focused, suggesting he's weighing each word carefully. Behar follows up, building on her initial point. She references broader expectations placed on public figures, suggesting that audiences often look to celebrities not just for entertainment, but for guidance or advocacy. Her delivery remains steady, but there's a firmness in her voice that signals she's not just making a general observation. She's inviting a more pointed response. Wahlberg listens without interrupting, maintaining eye contact. When he responds, there's a slight shift. His tone is still calm, but more direct now. He explains that while he understands the expectations, he doesn't necessarily agree with the idea that every public figure has the same responsibility to speak on every issue. He frames it as a matter of personal choice, emphasizing authenticity over obligation. At this point, the other hosts begin to lean in, both physically and conversationally. You can see it in their body language. Slight turns toward the center of the table, attentive expressions, hands resting more deliberately. The discussion is no longer just a guest interview. It's becoming a panel exchange. Behar responds again, this time narrowing her focus. She brings up specific examples, moments when celebrities have used their platforms to address social or political issues, and questions whether staying neutral or selective might come across as avoiding responsibility. Her tone remains controlled, but there's a noticeable edge, not aggressive but persistent. The audience reacts subtly, some murmurs, a few scattered claps when certain points land. It's the kind of response that signals engagement without overwhelming the conversation. The producers keep the cameras moving between speakers, capturing reactions in real time. Wahlberg's steady gaze, Behar's attentive posture, the co-hosts exchanging quick glances. Wahlberg's next response is where the tone begins to shift more clearly. He leans slightly forward, his hands coming together briefly before he speaks. His voice carries a bit more emphasis now. He reiterates his perspective, but this time he adds a layer of personal conviction. He talks about focusing on what he knows, on the causes he's personally connected to, rather than speaking broadly on every issue. There's no defensiveness, but there's a firmness that wasn't there before. Behar listens, nodding occasionally, but she doesn't fully concede the point. Instead, she reframes the discussion again, suggesting that influence itself carries a kind of implicit responsibility, whether one chooses it or not. It's not confrontational, but it's clearly a pushback. The pacing of the conversation slows slightly, not in a way that feels awkward, but in a way that signals careful navigation. Both are choosing their words more precisely now. The other hosts begin to interject in small ways, brief comments, clarifying questions, attempting to balance the exchange and keep it aligned with the show's tone. One co-host offers a middle ground perspective, acknowledging both sides. She points out that while not every celebrity may feel equipped to speak on every issue, audiences often interpret silence in different ways. It's a measured contribution, and for a moment, it diffuses the tension slightly. But the core disagreement remains. Wahlberg responds again, this time addressing that exact point. He explains that interpretation is out of his control, and that he believes in being genuine rather than trying to meet every external expectation. His tone is still respectful, but more resolute now. It's clear he's not backing away from his stance. Behar, maintaining her composure, nods but follows with another question, this one more direct. She asks whether there's ever a point where staying silent could be seen as a missed opportunity to make a positive impact. It's not accusatory, but it's pointed enough to keep the conversation in that tense space. The audience grows quieter, more attentive. These are the moments where live television feels most real, not because of raised voices, but because of the authenticity of the exchange. There's no script guiding this part, just two individuals expressing different viewpoints in real time. Wahlberg pauses before answering. It's a noticeable pause, just long enough to show he's considering the question carefully. When he speaks, his tone softens slightly, but the conviction remains. He acknowledges the possibility, but emphasizes that impact can take many forms, not all of them public or visible. He talks about personal actions, private efforts, and the idea that not everything needs to be broadcast to be meaningful. As he finishes, there's a brief moment of silence, just a second or two, before the conversation continues. It's not uncomfortable, but it's telling. It reflects the weight of what's being discussed, and the balance both sides are trying to maintain. The hosts begin to steer the conversation slightly, sensing the shift. There's an attempt to broaden the topic again, to bring in additional perspectives and keep the tone aligned with the show's format. But the underlying tension between Behar's line of questioning and Wahlberg's responses remains present, subtle but clear. And as the segment continues, it becomes evident that this isn't just a routine interview anymore. It's a moment where differing viewpoints are being explored in real time, with all the nuance, restraint, and occasional friction that comes with live television. As the conversation continues, the tone remains measured, but there's a noticeable shift in how each exchange unfolds. The panel is now fully engaged, and what began as a general discussion has clearly developed into a more focused back and forth. Mark Wahlberg sits with a steady posture, his attention fixed on the discussion, while Joy Behar maintains her role as both host and active participant, guiding the direction of the conversation without losing her own perspective. One of the co-hosts leans in slightly, offering a follow-up that attempts to bridge the gap between the two viewpoints. She frames the issue less as a question of obligation and more as a matter of influence. How public figures naturally shape conversations, even when they don't intend to. Her tone is calm, almost reflective, and it briefly softens the atmosphere at the table. Wahlberg nods as she speaks, acknowledging the point. When he responds, his voice carries a slightly more conversational tone again, as if trying to bring the discussion back to common ground. He explains that he doesn't reject the idea of influence, but rather approaches it in a way that feels personal and manageable. He emphasizes that his decisions are often based on what he feels genuinely connected to, rather than external expectations. Behar listens closely, her expression attentive, but still firm. As Wahlberg finishes, she leans forward just slightly, signaling that she's about to respond. Her next comment is more precise, focusing on how audiences interpret selective engagement. She suggests that when someone with a large platform speaks on certain issues but not others, it can lead to questions about consistency. The audience reacts again, this time with a few more audible murmurs. It's not disruptive, but it adds to the sense that the discussion is resonating. The camera briefly cuts to a wide shot, capturing the full panel and the audience behind them, before returning to the close-up exchange. Wahlberg's response comes quickly this time, with less of a pause than before. There's a subtle shift in his delivery, still calm, but more assertive. He explains that consistency, in his view, doesn't mean addressing everything equally, but rather staying true to one's own values and areas of understanding. He makes it clear that he prefers to speak when he feels informed and genuinely invested, rather than out of a sense of pressure. As he speaks, one of the other hosts nods in agreement, adding a brief comment that reinforces his point. She mentions that authenticity often resonates more with audiences than broad, generalized statements. This moment introduces a slight balance to the discussion, and for a brief period, the tension eases. However, Behar isn't finished with the topic. She follows up again, this time referencing how public conversations have evolved, especially in recent years. Without raising her voice or changing her tone dramatically, she highlights the idea that audiences today are more attentive to who speaks up and when. Her delivery remains composed, but there's a persistence that keeps the discussion anchored in that central question. Wahlberg listens without interruption, but his body language begins to reflect a bit more engagement. He leans forward slightly, his hands moving as he prepares to respond. When he does, his tone carries a bit more emphasis than before, not confrontational, but clearly more direct. He acknowledges the changing expectations, but reiterates that he doesn't believe every individual is suited to speak on every issue. At this point, there's a brief overlap in conversation. Behar begins to interject as Wahlberg finishes his sentence, and for a moment, both voices are heard at once. It's not chaotic, but it's one of the first signs of real-time friction. The kind that happens naturally in live discussions when both sides feel strongly about their points. The moderator role subtly shifts among the hosts. Another co-host steps in, gently redirecting the flow by summarizing what's been said so far. She outlines Wahlberg's emphasis on personal authenticity and Behar's focus on public responsibility, presenting both perspectives in a neutral way. This helps to reset the pacing slightly, giving both sides a moment to regroup. The audience responds with light applause, not for a specific point, but for the clarity the summary provides. It's a small but noticeable moment that reflects how engaged the viewers in the studio have become. Wahlberg takes that opportunity to clarify one of his earlier statements. His tone softens again, and he speaks in a more reflective manner. He explains that his approach is not about avoiding topics, but about choosing meaningful ways to contribute. He mentions that some of his efforts happen outside of public view, suggesting that not all impact is visible in the same way. Behar nods as he speaks, but her expression suggests she's still weighing his argument. When she responds, her tone is slightly less pointed than before, but the underlying question remains. She asks whether there's a balance to be found between private action and public acknowledgement, especially for individuals whose voices carry significant reach. The discussion at this point feels more layered. It's no longer just a back and forth, but a multi-dimensional conversation involving different interpretations of responsibility, influence, and authenticity. The hosts contribute in measured ways, each adding a piece to the broader picture. One co-host shares a personal perspective, describing how she has navigated similar expectations in her own career. Her tone is calm and introspective, and it introduces a more personal dimension to the discussion. She talks about the pressure to respond to every issue and how she has learned to set boundaries while still staying engaged. This contribution shifts the tone again, making the conversation feel less like a debate and more like a shared exploration. Wahlberg listens attentively, nodding as she speaks, and when he responds, there's a sense of appreciation in his tone. He agrees with her point about boundaries, reinforcing his earlier stance in a way that feels less defensive and more collaborative. Behar acknowledges the perspective as well, offering a brief comment that recognizes the complexity of the issue. For a moment, it seems like the conversation might move on to another topic. But then she adds one more thought, this time phrased as a broader observation rather than a direct question. She notes that public figures often become symbols, whether they intend to or not, and that this can shape how their actions are perceived. It's a subtle return to her original point, delivered in a way that keeps the discussion open rather than confrontational. Wahlberg responds with a slight nod, taking a moment before speaking. His next words are measured, but there's a renewed firmness in his tone. He agrees that perception plays a role, but emphasizes that individuals can't fully control how they're perceived. He reiterates that his focus remains on being genuine in his actions and choices. The audience remains quiet, listening closely. The energy in the room is steady, attentive, with no dramatic reactions, just the kind of focused silence that often accompanies meaningful conversation. As the segment progresses, the hosts begin to subtly guide the discussion toward a natural transition point. There are small cues, slight shifts in posture, glances toward the production team, and a gentle narrowing of the topic. But the core exchange between Wahlberg and Behar has already left its mark on the segment. What stands out is not a dramatic clash, but a sustained, thoughtful disagreement. One that unfolds gradually, with both sides maintaining composure while clearly holding different views. And as the conversation continues, it becomes clear that the moment is less about winning an argument and more about navigating the complexities of public dialogue in real time. As the discussion moves forward, there's a subtle but noticeable shift in rhythm. The earlier back and forth between Mark Wahlberg and Joy Behar has set the tone, and now the rest of the panel begins to engage more directly, creating a fuller, more layered exchange. The atmosphere in the studio remains controlled and professional, but there's a clear awareness among everyone at the table that the conversation has moved beyond a typical promotional interview. One of the co-hosts takes a moment to widen the lens of the discussion. She brings up how audiences often develop expectations based on past behavior, noting that consistency, whether intentional or not, becomes part of a public figure's identity. Her tone is thoughtful, and she directs the comment toward both Wahlberg and Behar, as if inviting a shared reflection rather than choosing a side. Wahlberg nods slightly, listening closely. His posture remains steady, but there's a growing sense of engagement in the way he prepares to respond. When he speaks, his voice carries a calm confidence, but also a bit more clarity than before. He explains that while he understands how patterns can shape perception, he doesn't believe those patterns should limit personal growth or flexibility. He suggests that people, including those in the public eye, evolve over time, and that their choices may change as a result. Behar listens with her usual attentiveness, her expression focused. As he finishes, she leans in just slightly, signaling that she wants to respond directly. Her next comment is less about challenging his point and more about refining the discussion. She acknowledges that growth is important, but she raises the idea that visibility brings a different level of scrutiny, one that doesn't always allow for quiet or gradual change. The audience reacts with a few soft murmurs, signaling recognition of the point. The camera briefly captures a couple of audience members nodding, reflecting the relatability of the topic. Back at the table, the hosts exchange quick glances, aware that the conversation is touching on something broader than just one individual's experience. Wahlberg takes a brief pause before responding, longer than in previous moments. It's not hesitation, but rather a deliberate choice to gather his thoughts. When he speaks again, his tone is measured, but there's a subtle firmness that underscores his words. He explains that while public scrutiny is part of the job, it doesn't necessarily define how he chooses to act. He emphasizes that his focus remains on doing what he believes is right, regardless of how it might be interpreted. At this point, there's a slight shift in body language across the panel. One co-host adjusts in her seat, leaning forward with her hands clasped together, clearly preparing to contribute. When she speaks, her tone is calm and balanced. She introduces the idea that public and private actions don't always have to be in conflict, that it's possible to maintain authenticity while also acknowledging the influence one holds. This comment seems to resonate with both sides. Wahlberg nods in agreement, and even Behar offers a small, acknowledging smile. For a brief moment, the tension softens, replaced by a sense of shared understanding. But the conversation doesn't fully settle there. Behar follows up with another observation, this time framed more as a reflection than a challenge. She points out that audiences often look for clarity, especially during moments of widespread discussion or concern. Her tone remains even, but there's a quiet persistence in her delivery that keeps the focus on accountability. Wahlberg listens carefully, his expression thoughtful. When he responds, he shifts slightly in his seat, leaning forward just enough to signal a deeper level of engagement. His voice carries a steady emphasis as he explains that clarity, in his view, comes from sincerity rather than frequency. He reiterates that speaking only when he feels informed allows him to be more genuine, rather than offering surface-level responses to meet expectations. As he speaks, there's a brief moment where Behar begins to respond at the same time, creating another small overlap in conversation. It's quickly resolved, with Wahlberg finishing his point and Behar nodding for him to continue. The exchange remains respectful, but these small moments of overlap highlight the intensity of the discussion, even within its controlled tone. The audience remains attentive, their reactions subdued but present. A few scattered claps follow one of Wahlberg's points, while a different section of the audience murmurs in agreement with Behar's earlier comments. It's a balanced response, reflecting the divided perspectives being presented. Another co-host steps in, this time asking a question that shifts the focus slightly. She asks Wahlberg how he personally decides when to speak publicly on an issue. The question feels less confrontational and more exploratory, offering him an opportunity to expand on his approach. Wahlberg responds with a thoughtful explanation, outlining how he considers both his understanding of the topic and his personal connection to it. He mentions that he takes time to reflect before speaking, rather than reacting immediately. His tone is calm, but there's a sense of conviction that reinforces his earlier points. Behar listens, her expression softening slightly as she processes his response. When she speaks again, her tone is less pointed than before, but still engaged. She acknowledges his perspective, but adds that immediacy can sometimes be important in shaping public conversations. It's not framed as a contradiction, but as an additional layer to consider. The discussion now feels more like a dialogue than a debate. The earlier tension hasn't disappeared, but it has evolved into something more nuanced. Each participant is building on the previous points, rather than simply countering them. One of the hosts shares an example from a past segment, recalling a moment when a public figure's statement had a significant impact on public perception. Her tone is reflective, and the example adds context to the broader discussion. It also brings the focus back to the role of visibility in shaping narratives. Wahlberg acknowledges the example, nodding as he listens. When he responds, he reiterates that impact can take many forms, and that not all of them are immediate or visible. His tone remains steady, but there's a subtle emphasis that suggests he's fully aware of the weight of the conversation. Behar, maintaining her composed demeanor, offers a final thought in this sequence of exchanges. She suggests that perhaps the balance lies somewhere in between speaking thoughtfully and recognizing the influence one holds. Her tone is calm, almost reflective, and it marks a slight shift from her earlier, more direct questioning. The audience responds with light applause, not tied to a specific argument, but to the overall exchange. It's the kind of reaction that acknowledges the complexity of the discussion rather than choosing a side. As the segment continues, the hosts begin to gently guide the conversation toward a broader conclusion. There are subtle cues. The pacing slows, the questions become more general, and the tone shifts toward reflection rather than debate. But the impact of the exchange between Wahlberg and Behar remains central. What stands out most in this portion of the conversation is the way both individuals maintain their positions while still engaging with each other's perspectives. There's no dramatic escalation, no raised voices, just a steady, thoughtful exploration of a topic that doesn't have a simple answer. And as the cameras continue to move between speakers, capturing each reaction and response, it becomes clear that this moment is less about disagreement and more about understanding how different viewpoints can coexist within the same conversation, even under the pressure of live television. As the segment continues, there's a noticeable shift in energy. Not a sharp turn, but a gradual tightening of focus as the conversation moves closer to its natural conclusion. The exchange between Mark Wahlberg and Joy Behar remains at the center, but now it carries a more reflective tone, shaped by everything that has already been said. One of the co-hosts steps in with a summarizing observation, carefully laying out the key points that have emerged so far. She notes that Wahlberg has consistently emphasized authenticity and personal connection, while Behar has highlighted the broader expectations that come with public visibility. Her delivery is calm and neutral, serving as a moment of clarity for both the panel and the audience. There's a brief pause after she speaks, the kind that often signals a transition. The audience remains quiet, attentive, as if anticipating how the conversation will resolve. Wahlberg takes that moment to adjust slightly in his seat, his posture still composed but now carrying a sense of finality, as though he's preparing to offer a more complete statement. When he begins speaking, his tone is steady and measured, but there's a subtle shift toward something more conclusive. He acknowledges the different perspectives that have been shared and expresses an understanding of why the topic matters to so many people. At the same time, he reiterates his belief that individuals should have the space to decide how and when they engage with public issues. His words are carefully chosen, not defensive, but clearly grounded in his own viewpoint. As he speaks, Behar listens without interruption, her expression attentive. There's less of the earlier insistence in her posture now, replaced by a more contemplative presence. When Wahlberg finishes, she nods slightly, taking a moment before responding. Her reply is measured, and there's a noticeable softening in her tone. Rather than pushing back directly, she reframes her perspective in a broader context. She explains that her questions come from a place of curiosity about how influence works in today's environment, especially given how quickly conversations can evolve. It's not a retreat from her earlier points, but rather a more reflective articulation of them. The audience reacts with a small ripple of applause, acknowledging the shift in tone. It's not loud or overwhelming, but it carries a sense of appreciation for the way the discussion has unfolded. Another co-host adds to this moment by sharing a brief thought about the nature of live conversations like this one. She points out that part of what makes these discussions meaningful is the ability to hear different viewpoints in real time, without them being filtered or simplified. Her comment feels like a gentle reminder of the purpose of the format itself. Wahlberg nods in agreement, and when he speaks again, his tone is slightly lighter. There's still seriousness in his words, but also a sense of ease that wasn't as present earlier. He acknowledges that conversations like this can be challenging, but also valuable, especially when they remain respectful. Behar responds with a small smile, and for the first time in several minutes, there's a hint of lightness in her expression. She makes a brief remark that echoes his sentiment, noting that disagreement doesn't have to mean conflict. It's a simple statement, but it shifts the atmosphere at the table in a noticeable way. The camera briefly cuts to a wider shot, capturing the full panel and the audience behind them. The body language across the table reflects the change. Shoulders relax slightly, expressions soften, and the pacing of the conversation slows. At this point, the hosts begin to guide the segment toward its closing moments. One of them introduces a final question, not directed at any one person, but open to the group. It focuses on what viewers at home might take away from the discussion. The tone of the question is reflective, inviting each participant to offer a closing thought. Wahlberg answers first. His response is concise compared to his earlier remarks, but it carries a sense of clarity. He emphasizes the importance of staying true to one's values while remaining open to listening and learning. His delivery is calm, and there's a sense that he's speaking not just to the panel, but to the audience watching at home. Behar follows, offering her own closing perspective. She reiterates the importance of awareness and engagement, framing it as part of a broader conversation that extends beyond any one show or moment. Her tone remains composed, and her words feel less like a challenge and more like an invitation to think. The other hosts contribute briefly, each adding a short reflection that ties into the overall theme. Their comments are measured and complementary, reinforcing the idea that the discussion has been about exploring different viewpoints rather than reaching a single conclusion. The audience responds with another round of applause, slightly louder this time, signaling appreciation for the conversation as a whole. It's not tied to any one statement, but to the collective exchange that has taken place. As the applause settles, there's a brief moment where the panel shares a quiet acknowledgement. Small nods, subtle smiles, the kind of unspoken recognition that often follows a meaningful discussion. The tension that was present earlier has eased, replaced by a sense of closure. The host leading the segment begins to wrap things up, thanking Wahlberg for joining the show and acknowledging the conversation that just took place. Her tone is warm and professional, maintaining the rhythm of live television as the segment approaches its end. Wahlberg responds with a polite thank you, his demeanor relaxed. There's no lingering tension in his expression, just a composed presence that reflects the way he's handled the discussion throughout. Behar offers a brief closing remark as well, something light but respectful, reinforcing the sense that the exchange, while serious at times, remained grounded and constructive. It's a small moment, but it helps to fully transition the tone away from the earlier intensity. The camera begins to pull back slightly, the visual cue that the segment is concluding. The hosts shift their focus toward the next topic, but the impact of the conversation remains evident, not in any dramatic way, but in the steady, thoughtful manner in which it unfolded. And as the show moves forward, it's clear that what just happened wasn't a confrontation in the traditional sense, but rather a sustained and realistic exchange of perspectives. One that reflected the kind of discussions that increasingly take place in public spaces, where differing viewpoints are not only expected, but necessary for a broader understanding. The final moments of the segment carry a sense of resolution, not because every question has been answered, but because each perspective has been heard. And in the context of live daytime television, that in itself becomes the most meaningful outcome. As the segment reaches its final moments, the transition from discussion to conclusion feels natural, almost seamless, as if the entire exchange has been building toward this point. The tone across the table is now noticeably calmer, reflective rather than analytical, with each participant settling into a more measured rhythm. Mark Wahlberg sits back slightly in his chair, his posture relaxed compared to earlier, while Joy Behar maintains a composed expression, her earlier persistence now softened into quiet attentiveness. The host leading the segment offers a final thank you, not just to Wahlberg, but to the entire panel for what she describes as a thoughtful and important conversation. Her tone is warm and steady, reflecting the way daytime television often closes moments like this, acknowledging the discussion without overstating it. The audience responds with a round of applause, this time more unified, signaling a shared appreciation for the exchange they've just witnessed. As the applause fades, the camera briefly lingers on the panel, capturing small, unscripted moments. A few of the hosts exchange quick smiles. One leans slightly toward another as if to share a quiet comment off mic, and Wahlberg nods politely in response to the closing remarks. These subtle interactions reinforce the sense that, despite the earlier tension, the conversation remained grounded in mutual respect. The show transitions to a short break, and when it returns, there's a noticeable shift in tone. The next segment moves on to a lighter topic, but the earlier discussion continues to resonate, not just in the studio, but beyond it. Within minutes of airing, clips from the exchange begin circulating online, with viewers sharing their reactions across platforms. Some viewers focus on Wahlberg's emphasis on authenticity, expressing agreement with his perspective that public figures should speak when they feel genuinely informed and connected to an issue. Others highlight Behar's points about influence and responsibility, noting that visibility often brings expectations that can't be entirely set aside. The responses are varied, but what stands out is the level of engagement. The conversation has clearly extended beyond the studio. On social media, short clips of the moment where Wahlberg leans forward to clarify his stance begin to gain traction. Viewers comment on his calm but firm delivery, describing it as measured and thoughtful. At the same time, other clips featuring Behar's questions are shared widely, with many viewers appreciating her willingness to press the issue without raising the tone of the conversation. Media outlets and entertainment commentators begin to pick up the story as well, framing it not as a heated clash, but as a nuanced discussion that reflects a broader cultural conversation. Headlines focus on the differing viewpoints rather than any dramatic conflict, emphasizing the respectful nature of the exchange. Back in the studio, after the show wraps, there are brief follow-up conversations among the hosts. These off-air moments, while not broadcast, are later referenced in interviews and behind-the-scenes segments. The hosts describe the discussion as one of those moments where live television captures something real, an unscripted exchange that unfolds naturally. Wahlberg, in a short post-show comment, reiterates his appreciation for the opportunity to have a genuine conversation. He emphasizes that while not everyone will agree, the ability to discuss different perspectives openly is what makes platforms like The View valuable. His tone remains consistent with how he carried himself during the segment, calm, respectful, and grounded. Behar also reflects on the moment in a later segment, briefly acknowledging the discussion and the responses it generated. She notes that part of her role is to ask questions that encourage deeper thinking, even if they lead to moments of tension. Her comments are measured, reinforcing the idea that the exchange was intentional in its direction, but still organic in how it unfolded. Audience members who attended the live taping share their own experiences online, describing the atmosphere in the room as focused and engaged. Many mention how the conversation felt different from typical segments, not louder or more dramatic, but more attentive, with a sense that everyone present was genuinely listening. In the days that follow, the conversation continues to circulate, not as a viral controversy, but as a reference point for discussions about public figures and responsibility. Commentators revisit specific moments, analyzing the language used, the pacing of the responses, and the way the hosts navigated the exchange. What becomes clear over time is that the impact of the segment lies not in any single statement, but in the overall tone. It serves as an example of how disagreement can be expressed without escalation, how different perspectives can be explored without turning into confrontation. For viewers at home, the takeaway varies. Some come away with a stronger appreciation for Wahlberg's emphasis on personal boundaries, while others find themselves agreeing with Behar's focus on the broader implications of influence. But regardless of where they land, the conversation prompts reflection, and that, in many ways, becomes its lasting effect. As the episode continues to be discussed, the producers of the show briefly address the segment in a behind-the-scenes clip released online. They highlight the importance of allowing conversations to unfold naturally, even when they move in unexpected directions. It's a small insight, but it adds context to how moments like this are handled in real time. Looking back, The exchange fits into a larger pattern of discussions that have taken place on daytime television, where the balance between information, opinion, and personal experience is constantly being negotiated. It's not unusual, but it stands out for its steadiness, the way it builds gradually, holds tension without breaking, and resolves without forcing a conclusion. As the narrative of the segment comes to a close, it leaves behind a sense of completeness, not because every question has been answered, but because the conversation reached a natural endpoint. The participants express their views, listen to one another, and maintain the tone expected of a live daytime talk show. And for those watching, whether in the studio or at home, it becomes a reminder of what these platforms can offer at their best. A space where different ideas can be shared openly, where disagreement doesn't have to lead to division, and where even a routine segment can turn into something more meaningful. If you watched this moment unfold, or if you've seen the reactions since, share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.